And hi, everybody. This is John Wolpert and team for the Baseline Protocol Community Q&A weekly session. We're going to have a pretty casual day today. And hi, everybody. This is John Wolpert and team for the Baseline Protocol. Oops. Every week I do the same thing.
Let's do time warp again.
Every week. So in my spare time, I've been trying to get live streaming set up better so that we have a better intro. You can't crop the beginning of a live stream later on without, losing continuity. So this is a pretty casual session today. We're setting up for a big week next week, trying to get the baseline show set up with some better production values and that sort of thing. I was up late last night fooling around with OBS and all this stuff, and didn't get it to work in time for today. But we're gonna have our normal just Q&A session, and it would be great if we can. I don't know that we're going to get a lot of questions today, which is fine. I think this is a good opportunity for us to talk about what's coming next after next week's version 0.1 release. And for that, we have Anis Sofrank to talk about specifications and standards development and what we have in mind for that. And we may have some other folks coming on to talk about how to be a contributor to the work after v0.1 comes out. So with that, Anis, would you like to introduce yourself and talk about what your primary interest is?
Yes, sure. So my name is Anis Sofrank, and I'm the director and principal consultant at Conformance. So we are an operations consulting practice, and we specialize in post-acquisition IT integration. So anything from analysis of as-is states, definition of to-be state, gap analysis, conducting feasibility study, technical feasibility, implementation, and business readiness to go live as well. So my core interest in the baseline protocol is definitely on the specification and standardization side. I've been very involved with large enterprise, and I'm fully aware of the constraints in terms of standard requirement for solutions in general, enterprise solutions in general. So when it comes to specification for the baseline protocol, I don't only think about the protocol specification itself, but also the larger umbrella of mainnet specifications. So what are the functional and non-functional spec for an always on enterprise service bus, but also other specs that may emerge from the wider community in terms of industry specific specification. If we talk about finance or very specific sector of retail, etc., etc. So just for everybody on the call or on YouTube as well. So when we talk about the upcoming release of the baseline protocol, v0.1, it's a great opportunity for us now to talk about, to state what are the core requirements. So the core capabilities, features, component of the baseline protocol. And in addition to those requirement specifications, so what should the protocol basically do and deliver on? How it should do it. So the more design-focused specification, how those features should be delivered. One key thing working with different people and going through the repo is we have to be sure that we identify and we understand the various stakeholders of the protocol and to be sure what our audience is for the specifications. And I include protocol specifications, but mainnet specifications as well. And once we have those, fingers crossed, when we go through the OASIS editorial process, the specification will eventually become a standard, a recognized standard to be used within enterprise. Yeah.
So that, I mean, that really is the thing, right? I mean, we have de facto standards in the blockchain community, right? We have different projects that are delivering code under various names, and if everybody uses those platforms, then they're, you know, effectively a standard in their own right. In this case, you know, let's talk about the need for why did we go into the OASIS open standards body, which for folks who are on the, you know, viewing and may not know, it's a very venerable standards organization behind SGML, SAML, MQTT, AMQP, lots of things that run the internet.
Yeah,
And,
it's for, oh,
yeah.
sorry. It's for the credibility and the rigor of the editorial process. So once the baseline protocol is published, it gives, on the enterprise side, certainty and recognition, because OASIS has been around and I've published very well-known protocols and other specifications as well. So I think this is the added benefit of the baseline protocol, going one step further than the, oh, everybody uses it, so it's a de facto standard, to it is a recognized standard who went through a very rigorous process. And that gives, from an enterprise point of view, procurement point of view, and well, how should I pay for that solution rather than that solution? The confidence and the certainty, and for all the future baseline solution provider, it's just a great benefit. A great benefit to raise.
So that's, I mean, that's really it's an interesting thing too, right? That we have the EEA, the Ethereum Ecosystem Alliance, or Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, which is, it's in unto itself a standards organization. We're related to them, and it's not really them, it's an us, right? So we're, you know, we're all one kind of bigger happy family. We happen to be using the OASIS platform for the baseline specifications, and EEA, and the main networking group, which we're all very much a part of, is also pumping out specifications and standards for the larger Ethereum ecosystem. Right? So that'll be an interesting thing to see how we dovetail those two efforts together, how we support each other as kind of one team. Do you have any thoughts on that? And I don't mean to put you on the spot. You may not. I mean, that's a.
I do have an opinion on that. I don't know if it's a well-informed opinion as of yet.
Well, that's the way I do. So that's
However, when I first came across the baseline protocol and the project in itself and relating to public mainnets, my vision was everybody, regardless of blockchain, should be able to baseline, because it's a pattern, and it's a credible pattern on how enterprises and counterparties can interact with each other. So where I understand that baseline is, you know, coming from the Ethereum side, so there is strong support, but I do not see why baseline protocol or the baseline pattern, or we can decline it, however, or baseline protocol for Ethereum, baseline protocol for X cannot be a thing. We start with Ethereum, but if we are confident into the protocol in terms of its core component and the value that it adds, what will we not look to scale and bring it to the blockchain? That's a very personal opinion here.
right. So in the case of, let's talk about, so for example, on this project, on the baseline project, when it comes to, and by the way, that was I think well said, and certainly not uninformed. I think we're pretty lucky to have somebody like you that has come forward to lead a lot of the standards work. I don't know how that happened. I don't know. Maybe you can you tell us more about why you're how you came to it, how you found out about it, and why did you decide to become a contributor to it?
So I first found out about it through Chainlink, actually, interestingly. I was watching a Chainlink videos on YouTube and the different projects that they were currently involved on, and basically I stumbled upon Baseline. So it was not a major press release, it was a genuine interest in the community and what was happening in the wider blockchain community, rather than purely from an enterprise point of view first. It's like, okay, blockchain, what's happening? So, and I decided to be a contributor. It's a bit of a synchronicity because I was working on the project for finance transformation and working with supplier debt, and it's, yeah. And I just thought to myself, oh, that's what was needed. Why we are like 5 years late on, but figure of speech. But yeah, basically I was working in the middle of a project, and it just tilted to me that this is exactly what is needed on that project. I didn't know it at that time, but it just all made sense. So I started investing the time going into GitHub, and I invite everybody to go into GitHub, to go on the website, get familiar with the documentation, and it's very easy to contribute. I was happily surprised of how responsive the team or the different contributors from the different companies were. And it just gave me the confidence to, contribute and step and say, okay, what can I bring? What type of value? And one of my first questions to the team, if you remember, was how can non-developer contribute? Because there are so many things to be done. You don't have to be basically writing code every day to bring value to the baseline protocol and the baseline team as a contributor. So,
sure, but as I've learned as we've had many conversations now, you're pretty legitimately technical, and
yes,
right. So it's not like you don't. Yeah, and I think that's really, is to have somebody who really is deeply experienced in how these systems work in enterprise environments. Right, you do a lot of system integration over the years, right? Old school stuff. Tell us about. And by the way, here's Sam Stokes, who is the new maintainer among the maintainers crew, the folks who maintain the code. Sam is stepped up to be the person responsible and accountable for making sure that we have lots of really good contributors and that people know how to contribute. So in a way, it's a perfect combination to have the two of you on. Sam, it's good to see you.
Yeah.
You want to say a few words? Sam, you work for Consensus, and
yeah, I work with John and others at Consensus, and been involved in the Baseline project since I guess about a year ago, since we first started working with EY and Microsoft. And yeah, it's been an exciting development from the early stages to open sourcing it back in March. And yeah, happy to get as many contributors as we can, and we're trying to make it as easy as possible to for other people to understand the code and then allow them to contribute to the code base.
So I think what Anais is talking about with regard to trying to contribute, it's a great story, right? You know, that you don't just have to, you don't necessarily just have to write code. You could do a lot of things. And as the specifications and standards come up in September, after VU 0.1 comes out, there's going to be a lot of opportunity for people to write specifications. Anais, what are you looking for in that community? Like, who do you want to see helping out in the specifications? Security folks? Maybe the two of you can talk about that.
Yep, sure. So as I mentioned earlier, there are different specifications under the broader baseline specification, and this include security. I think it was mentioned on the call on Monday that there is a security compliance component that will facilitate greatly the basically enterprise trusting baseline solutions. So anybody who has experience or other, and I want to mention as well, it's not only enterprise, but governmental organization as well, may be a great asset on the more skills side rather than domain side. anybody who has experience writing business requirement or product specifications will also be a great asset to the team, definitely.
That's great. So hopefully there's folks out there who will hear that and say, oh, I can get involved. By the way, let me put a PSA up. To get involved, go to baseline-protocol.org and follow the prompt to get on the Slack. We have Slack, Discord, and Telegram, and other ways of interacting with each other. But I think a lot of it is on Slack, truth be told, right? So get on there, find any of us, and ask questions and see where you can get involved. Get on the GitHub and write a pull, do a pull request, or just generally get involved. So that's the easiest way to do it. Anis, actually Sam and Anis, maybe you could talk about the relationship between the reference implementation that's coming out next week and the standards work, right? So for example, the v0.1 reference implementation is a package of code. It's going to be dropped. If you're interested in that, go on to the init core branch of the baseline repo in GitHub, and you can see what the work is. Everything that we do is out in the open. It's transparent, sometimes uncomfortably so. And so you can get involved there, but that's the code for a specific reference implementation. So Sam, maybe you can talk about that, and Anis, maybe we can talk about how that's not exactly the same as the specification, as the standard.
No, indeed. Oh, Sam, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. I can just say for the, in the 0.1 release, there is a new reference implementation, and it's meant to be a very simple implementation that I guess demonstrates how to import and use the core libraries that are also being released. So hopefully it's a little bit easier to understand than maybe Radish 34, which was our first demo and implementation that's pretty complex and is a specific supply chain use case. So the hope is that this will be a good example and be maybe a little bit easier to follow with a few less layers. And yeah, it provides some interfaces that going forward, people can import and use themselves. And so hopefully you're not having to write as much custom code. You can use what we're providing there and then maybe tweak it a little bit to your specific use case. But hopefully it's making your life as a developer a bit easier where you're not having to do everything from scratch.
Yes, and in addition to that, from a specification and standard point of view, we really need to differentiate between the specification and the implementation of those specifications. So if we think about it, we'll have the capabilities. What are the capabilities of the baseline protocol? And so, for example, privacy is key in the enterprise world. And the requirement specification will be, okay, it must support, so the baseline protocol must support private transaction on the Ethereum mainnet, for example. And the high-level design specification will address, okay, how should the private transaction be supported on the Ethereum mainnet? And this is addressed through a microservice, the zero-knowledge service. So it's going through that, those, it's a bit of a funnel. We start with the capabilities, the function, what they are, what must be implemented, should be implemented, not be implemented. And the code, really, all the interfaces is more on the how it should be done. What is the architecture? And as Sam mentioned, it will help the builders and the developers. So when we illustrate the specifications with real implementation from init.core, it will help speed up the learning process on how to implement the baseline protocol as on the client side, etc. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's what it's all about. Oh, by the way, Nick was showing up oddly as my name, and that was weird, but I think you fixed that. Nick,
yeah, it turns out if I hit the link in the calendar invite, because I've got 2 entries, if I hit the wrong one, I show up as you. Otherwise, I get to show up as me. So
another bug to fix before next week. That's gets exciting. Um, Nick, can you keep an eye on questions? Anything coming in? We'll just keep on going with Sam and Anise here, because I think this is a good thing for to have on the record. This is what we're about. This is what we're going to be doing. And I think there could be some confusion when things come out next week. Say, oh, is this a platform? Is this something? Like, no, it happens to have. It's for example, Sam is using NATS as the messaging layer. It's using provides stack to make it easy to deploy stuff. And it's got a number of other components, but other providers could come in and add their components as long as they're consistent with the specification, which is why it's so important, Anise, right, to get that specification written so people know with confidence what are the components that should be used and which ones aren't.
Yes, that's correct. I think a very good job was done in documenting already in the init core the code itself. So it's going the level of abstraction and say, this is a code. We understand, for example, that Zocrate is being used for the zero knowledge service, but can other tools be used as well? Same for Whisper NATS. Can we use another messaging protocol? And if so, what are the requirements that we need to fulfill to deliver whatever messaging protocol we may be using? Yeah. So that will be the key focus in terms of requirement specification and design specification versus implementation, which is the implementation in the core implementation of the release, which is here to show, okay, this is how those specifications have been implemented, as an example.
So let's take an example of that, like, yeah, with NATS. What would, so standards usually show up as musts and shoulds and shan'ts, right? That's how a standard is written. We have a standards document that is being cooked up right now, right? And we're doing that on Google Docs for now in the core team. Then we'll publish that onto GitHub pretty soon, right? So tell us more about where that, Sam, let's talk about messaging. What would be an example of a shan't or something that wouldn't be allowed in a baseline compliant messaging service? Maybe we can talk about that, and then we can talk about how that would be written up and where we could use some help from experts in the field on that.
Yeah. I don't know too much about specification speak, so the shan'ts and musts and everything. Not quite sure what their definitions are, but I know when we originally were looking at Radish 34, the characteristics, yeah, that's the original reference implementation of baseline. What the characteristics we were initially looking for included, ideally we wanted something that was decentralized. We wanted something that your messages were not public. It was more of a peer-to-peer messaging. So ensuring as much privacy as possible. We wanted some sort of message guarantee, like delivery guarantee, that the messages were reaching their destination. So some subset of those and other characteristics will probably be included in that specification.
Yeah. So yeah, let's talk about that. So when companies say that they want to, if they want to baseline their product or do a baseline solution like Coke One North America did pretty famously last week or week before. In that case, they're going to want to know what? They're going to want to know that when they move some data from them to a counterparty, that they're reaching that particular counterparty and that nobody else has the data, right? Because GDPR, information security would be, you have some concern there, right? If lots of different uninvolved machines were receiving those messages, even if they were encrypted, right? So, Ace, would that be, how would we approach that? We would say, okay, well, we've written this code. We've shown how we can do that in Nats. And here's the abstraction, the generalization of that to say, do this, don't do that.
Yeah. So I guess this is where we'll have to impose on whoever built a baseline solution product or service to use the interface that has been designed and implement, well, not implemented, that has been made available for whoever would want to. Sorry, I have an echo here. So there are a series of. Hello? Yeah, there are a series of interfaces that will be made available and that will need to be used. And those have been designed and well thought of. And this is where I may not be the most appropriate person to go into the technicalities of how to ensure, and I will need to dig into a bit more into this. But yes, as you said, for GDPR reasons, we need to have a clear audit trail of the messages that have been exchanged, when they were sent, who receives them, etc. So all of those core functions are made available as part of the baseline protocol, and any implementation or deployment will need to use those functions and those interfaces.
Right. So that's, I mean, that's where the work is going to come in, right? And that's why it's important. Yeah, I used to, some friends of mine used to say, it's important, code talks and talk walks. But in something like this, where we're really starting to get mature about how to use blockchain in industry, we're going to need to be able to say, yeah, but we also know that the code works the same way, regardless of who's putting the solution together, right?
Yeah, so conformance is a key part of the specification. And we will have to decide if we impose different conformance levels and what is the minimum conformance level that a baseline solution or service need to meet. So there will be conformance tests for sure. And who knows, maybe in the future, conformance certifications, certified baseline product. So
yeah, I think it would be interesting to see what happens as we go forward into the future. Standards bodies often license their certification packages, and but in software that's harder because like why do I have to? If you're doing a radio frequency certification or something like that, and you can pay for the IEEE certification. That's all. There's enforceability, but in software that's less easy. You could say, well, hey, here's the package that is certified and the runtime is signed, right? So that we know that even though the open source, you could look at the open source, you don't necessarily know that the particular implementation that you're looking at that hasn't had some naughty code, put in during compile. So I think that might be an opportunity for standards bodies going forward, is to say, we are also on the hook, not just for certifying and saying that you're compliant or your open source package is compliant, whatever, that we've inspected it, but that the actual runtime is signed by us, the certifying agency. So that might be an interesting way for standards bodies and software to go.
If you think back to some of the early days like ODBC, right? You'd have different versions of ODBC, and as you move from 1 to 2 to 3, you pick up additional functionality. And it may or may not be backward compatible depending on the specification. So ODBC, man, I thought I'd never say that again.
Do you remember the acronym?
Open database call or something like that. I don't remember it.
I don't either. Hey, Nick, what are we looking at on are there any good questions that are coming in through the chat?
There are a number around kind of Unibrite's involvement and how the Unibrite stack is being used in baseline. And a couple around, are there regulatory hurdles that need to be considered when baselining? I know in the Slack, Mr. Coleman had a question about what was in the smart contracts as well. If we want to tackle that today, might be good food for thought.
I think that last one first, and I'll get into the regulatory one in a second. Yeah, Tim's question is an important one. What's up with the smart contracts and how, what?
Hi, do you want me to ask a bit more around that?
Love that. Me too.
That was, yeah, in fact, Annie, sorry for pronouncing your name wrongly earlier, but you said that you were involved with post-acquisition IT integrations, which is great, and I'm very excited to sort of learn how to sort of sell, in inverted commas, the benefits of using something like Baseline. Like today, I was having a conversation with someone who, because of different databases and different organizations being out of sync with each other, ended up losing a whole bunch of money. I mean, that kind of happens, and that's why the auditors need to be there to stop things like the Wirecard thing happening, where they're pretending they've got billions of dollars in offshore accounts, right? But what I'd really like to know, as you mentioned, based on my question, Nick, in the Slack, is I'm finding it hard to articulate the question because of the limits of my technical knowledge. Like, I've done some work with sort of basic deployment of zero knowledge proof contracts on Ethereum chain, but my knowledge is quite limited, and I do need someone with a much deeper technical knowledge to help me to understand, maybe even just how to articulate my question properly. Because when I released a ZKP smart contract using Socrates, that was one contract which was released, right? So that was the business logic, which is on chain. However, when that contract was used, the result of that was stored on chain. Now, after a conversation I had with someone yesterday, I think that with the Baseline, if I'm understanding correctly, that business logic would be stored on chain. However, the result of it and the computation, yeah, exactly, and the computation would be done off chain as well. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's starting to make more sense now.
Also got Brian Chamberlain is also on if he wants to jump in. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, just want to say that I guess what goes on chain is there's a verifier contract. So off chain, you would create this proof, meaning you run your inputs through a ZKP circuit, and the output of that eventually is a proof, which more or less is a hash and some whatever the public inputs were. So that's what you end up running through the verifier contract, which is on chain. And then assuming that you have produced a valid proof and it passes the verification, that's what allows you to store a commitment in the Merkle tree. So the existence of a commitment in the Merkle tree on chain is saying that you have a valid proof and it is run through the process. And it can't exist in that Merkle tree unless it's gone through that verification.
And
cool.
and the simplest proof is everybody's done something consistently, right? So it's not simply here's some data. If I produce the data, this hash will prove that this is the original data. This is a little more involved, right? This is saying here's some data, and here is everybody that was involved in getting that proof onto the Merkle tree had to have recorded the same data in the same way, generated the same result, digitally signed it, and that all results in a complete, well, I was about to say circuit, but that would, in this context, that would be misleading, in a complete workflow, right? So you're really getting a proof of consistency as opposed to just a proof of existence.
And that could be a row in a database, a cell in a spreadsheet, or a complete object, even like a DocuSign contract or something like that. Is that correct, John?
Sam?
Yeah, there's different different levels of resolution, I guess, with your data, but yeah, it could be as small as you want. I guess it's kind of defined by how you set up your ZKP circuit, but we're trying to make it as general as possible, where essentially you would input a hash, and that hash could represent a small chunk of data or a large document. But you submit that plus your public inputs, and that's what gets verified.
And Anise, that seems to me to be a really interesting area where we're going to need a lot of contributions from the zero knowledge community, right? To say that the cryptography community is going to have a lot to say about the right ways and the wrong ways to implement a baseline circuit. And we're going to have to say, yep, these are the things that qualify as a baseline circuit, and these are the ways you shouldn't do. So that's going to be so if we're fishing for, hey, how can you contribute as somebody that wants to get involved with baseline, folks that are involved in that space should give you a call, right?
Yes, definitely.
Awesome. So, Sam, let's turn to you and talk about your role as sort of the czar of contributions and finding more maintainers and having people get involved. What do you want people to know about ways to get involved? Are there specific areas in the code base right now where an enterprising developer might want to contribute?
Yeah, there's a couple different places. Before we go there, Brian, just want to check with him, see if he had anything to add to the previous question.
Hey, Brian.
I guess a little, but not much more. Just that, just to make it clear that there's a few nuances to what we've got in the zero knowledge and smart contract, kind of how they work together. So the Socrates library actually, I don't know if this was clear, but it makes a verifier contract as part of how it operates. So you define, this is kind of getting into the mechanics of it, but you define your logic of your business logic or whatever objects and things that you want to operate on in a custom DSL that's based on the Socrates. The people who wrote that library designed that. And
domain language, right?
What was that?
DSL domain
language. So it looks like a programming language, but just one that you're not familiar with because it's custom to their way of viewing the world. And so that is then helpful because if you codify your business logic in this domain-specific language, the Socrates library will do a lot of work for you. It'll produce a number of artifacts. The proving key, verifying keys that are used both publicly and privately, the actual smart contract, the verifier contract that's linked to those proving keys is also part of it. So when you codify your business logic using Socrates, you have these artifacts that you have to then use both locally in the Radish deployment and then on chain. So you have to deploy this custom smart contract for your logic. And then that logic and that custom smart contract could work with the kind of generic, the more generic contract that handles the baseline workflow. Because you imagine someone doing a transaction, you would want a generalized contract that understands the pattern of how to prove that something exists, but the actual specifics of what the details are gets kind of handled in a separate contract. So you kind of point to that other contract and say, okay, well, this is the verifier contract. I'm going to provide it the public details of my private transaction. It's going to tell me, this is all happening in a transaction on chain. It's going to tell me whether or not the logic is accurate. And so that is kind of a state of the art at this point. But as Sam mentioned, and Karthik was on the call, I think he's been doing research into making it more generic, because you can imagine it'd be challenging to have support dynamic business processes that require a lot of this back end work to set up these contracts and deploy them and have them available and link them into existing smart contracts that manage baseline flow. So I guess the other side of Socrates is it's a massive library, but the DSL is a little bit limited too, because you have to learn a whole language to write it. So there are other folks out there looking at using Go. Gnark is one that's Consensus is working on. And that's, you're writing your smart contract library language in Go. Sorry, your business logic in Go. I think there's ones for Python as well. So it's definitely an evolving space, and having standards I think would be helpful for that. Although I wonder, this is not, I don't know if there's an answer to this, like what that appropriate level of abstraction is, because there's so much about what happens in the on-chain component of verifying a interaction between two parties that's custom to that, that's really unique to the business problems. You know, it's like, how do you define this? What the appropriate structure is to enforce that there's interoperability there, so that you don't have to have every time you have a business transaction generating all these new artifacts and new logic that you have to deploy on chain, and just adds to the cost and the operational overhead of maintaining those over time. So I'd be interested to see where standards kind of come in as a layer on top of all of that. That's all I wanted to add to.
Just to your point about what is the right level of abstraction is a question that we will have to keep asking, and have to ensure that when the way we approach specification and standardization is consistent. And I was wondering myself, and that's just a thought that I'm sharing with, is there is a consistent approach, a mental approach to us, like to the team, writing specifications and writing standard in how to set this limit. And it's only with the expertise of people who do have the experience with those different libraries, packages, that we need all of that knowledge coming together, basically, so we can define. So having more people with the right expertise and people who understand as well what has been done in terms of Radish, what has been done in terms of init core, will become like increasingly key from September.
Yeah, definitely.
That's for sure. And I think it would be good. Brian, Sam, do you, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I mean, if you're thinking about where would a new person coming in want to, what would be your place if you were brand new and you wanted to just make a contribution, if you wanted to help improve the code somewhere, or do something where you could add something that seems obvious that hasn't been put into a function for this, or where would you go to add a what would be your place? Where would you've been looking at the code a lot. What would you add? You don't have to do it right now.
I guess I'll answer that two ways. I think if someone wants to get started, actually it's really super valuable to, everyone approaches a project from different perspectives. So it has different backstory, different history, different experiences. So something that's really valuable for really any project is someone trying to bridge the gap on their own of like, okay, here's this open source project, this baseline concept. Well, how do I apply it to something that I know really well? And even just that act of trying produces a lot of valuable results. It helps you understand what baseline is more, then you understand the gaps that may exist. Let's say you're working in an industry that we're not really addressing directly, talking to the community and getting involved and trying to build out the baseline. I think it'll be kind of, maybe after you do that experiment, it might be obvious like what you should contribute, because you could see the deficiencies a little more clearly. Not in a bad, deficiencies in a bad way, I guess maybe like a gap analysis kind of a way of thinking about it. So that's always very valuable. So just that experience of using it, trying it, just spending time with it. And I mean, in this case, well, the Radish example, that's what's soon to be the init core, writing a little proof of concept. But in terms of like specifics, area of init core, well, I guess my personal bias is around the messaging layer because we spent so much time thinking about that. I think there's a lot of interesting areas to think about. I mean, a big part of baseline is exchanging private information because it's, I mean, it's like that layer of business still has to go on. What you get is the additional kind of public information that verifies the private information, but you still have to exchange private information. So that is a very common challenge for integrating different organizations and different technologies. So I think that's an area for standards for sure, but then also for writing different implementations. So look at something that instead of Whisper and Nats, like what about something fun like WhatsApp or Signal or just UDP or something. I mean, you know, I think we're early on. What was that?
Microsoft Teams.
Sure, yeah. Or you like to say carrier pigeon. Like, I mean, what if that was actually, you know, what if you actually had to snippet like letters of actual print out a QR code, mail it to somebody, and then anyway, so.
Hey, interesting idea.
Yeah. So that's my bias. So I think.
I love you have such creative ideas, Brian. Never cease to amaze me. So I think if I were to, I'll buy Sam some time to think about maybe one. But if I'd love the idea of, for example, there's one of the demos. I think it's the Google Sheets demo. The developers of that had to write a custom set of code to make sure that Google Sheets and Microsoft Dynamics, when there was a baseline record, that record couldn't easily be altered by a user. And now that we have that in the example, it's got to go into the actual protocol code, which hasn't been done yet. And won't be, you know, that's not going to be in v0.1. So I think that would be a really good example of something where somebody could literally look at the example and say, I can abstract that. I'm going to put that in. I'm going to make a name for myself. A good example. I saw a couple of other ones on the Slack just the other day where somebody was saying, would it be okay if I added this function or this method to this thing here? And the answer was yes, it's okay, do that. Sam, do you have any examples of that?
Yeah, I think the example you gave with so what you're referring to with the databases, different database types, or wherever the data is being stored on each participant's system, that's going to live in the persistence package, which is going to be released with v0.1, but it's kind of just a skeleton interface right now with not much meat to it. So if anybody wanted to get involved in trying to help write some of that interface, that would be great. Or I think there's this new reference implementation that's going to be released, and we have some existing ones. So I think some good work to do would be to try to apply these interfaces and libraries that we're releasing, apply those to existing demos and give us some feedback there if the interfaces are too restrictive and need some more functionality. That would be great to know, and we can help try to build that in. Hopefully, want to try to avoid breaking changes if possible, but sometimes that's necessary. So yeah, getting that feedback, if anybody wants to take that on, that would be great.
Terrific. Going back to the original previous questions, one was on regulatory and one was on a particular company, Unibright, in the community. And I'll take the second one first and just say that Unibright in particular is, and Provide and a number of other companies have, I don't want to take any away from anybody as the DSC chair. I want to make sure that everybody gets equal love. But just in particular, those are good examples of companies who have really stepped up. There's nothing about the protocol that says you have to use their stuff. There's no fundamental connection, but they have done so much in terms of leading and in terms of contributing that they're getting a lot of deal flow, because people who are interested in baseline are saying, well, who's really doing stuff there? Oh, these guys are. So that's why they had a pretty notable announcement last week about a pretty huge client. I think that's a good lesson for everybody, is to say, you know, if you want to get the benefits of people being interested in baseline, it's not so much just getting your brand associated. It's about contributing, getting involved, getting to know the other engineers and writers and others that are in the community, building trust with them. And you don't have to spend a lot of time doing that. You can do that very simply just by showing up, right? It doesn't take that much time. So that would be my, you know, how is Unibright involved? They're involved because they're involved. And they're not the only ones, of course. So if your name wasn't called out today, don't be too mad at me. But that was the question. On the regulatory side, that's fairly relevant. You know, the most important thing in terms of regulatory is that the databases, the systems of record at the edges, are in fact compliant, right? That if you have to be handling personally identifiable information within your jurisdiction the way you're supposed to, before that ever touches baselining. But Anais, maybe this is the last question for you. What do you think? Do you think that that's one of the things that we'll have to put in this in the specification? Is here are the requirements for the edge system. So, for example, SAP or Oracle or Dynamics. Will we have to say you have to implement those in a certain way in order to be baseline compliant?
So the specifications and standards will have security considerations. Now, is it in the remit of the baseline protocol to indicate to stakeholders how their ERP or CRM should be conform to their local or national regulatory or even regional? I don't think so. I mean, GDPR is not within the remit of the baseline protocol. However, understanding the stakeholders of the protocol from a system or key actor point of view will allow us to think about what are the security considerations that we need to include in the specifications and in the standard. So for now, at least with what we started doing, this would be my thought on the regulatory side. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I think that's great. And to everybody on the panel, again, this is sort of the calm before the storm. We have a big week next week, not just on our front. There's a lot of news happening in the blockchain community in the next period of time. So in the proximate, coming days and months. And it's a pretty exciting time to be here. Last point I'll say is that we are, in fact, I think this call might have given me a thought that not only are we going to be putting up a sponsors page on the Baseline website soon that says, hey, if you're a sponsor, you're just to say, hey, you are involved in Baseline. But also, it seems to me that we ought to have a badge on there that says, this product is involved in Baseline, or is in fact, once the standard version 1 of the standard is out, say it's compliant with baselining. So here's, SAP is compliant, or Dynamics, or what have you. So that would be Chainlink, Unibright provide. Say not only works with baselining, is compliant with baselining, is a top, it has passed the baseline security protocol exam, that sort of thing, and that should give companies that are wanting to do baselining a menu of companies that they can be working with. It seems like a pretty good idea.
Certified.
Yeah, or just at least calling them out to say, yep, this is they can put that moniker on their product. With that, I think we'll call it a day for this week, and we'll see you all next week. There's very likely a very exciting set of people that will be on the show next week, and we'll be talking about some interesting stuff. See everybody. Happy baselining.